I'm your host, Tess Brigham. So let's start making sense of the mess together. So today, as you can see, is a solo show. And I want to talk about something that comes up all the time when I talk about the generations, which is this. Every generation thinks that the next one has it so much easier than them. And we do this every single time. And yeah, every time we think the younger people aren't as tough as we are, we don't think that they're as capable. We're like, oh my God, our world's going to fall apart if these are our young people, right? This is a bit of what we do. And there's a part of it there's a grief to it as well. And I'm going to get into that. So let's dive in. Like I said, every generation thinks the next one has it easy. And the story is as old as time, right? One generation looks at the next one and says, well, you don't know how good you had it. Boomers said that about us, about Gen Xers. Gen X, we said this about millennials. And millennials, they're saying it about Gen Z. And unfortunately, boomers were saying it about millennials and Gen X and boomers are talking about Gen Z. It's the younger people always get kind of piled on. So, and one day Gen Z will say, the same thing to Generation Alpha, that, they're going to turn and be like, oh, this Generation Alpha, they can't have anything, they can't handle anything. So it's almost like this weird rite of passage for us, right? We look back at our own struggles and then think about, like, look back at our own struggles and then you see someone else's comfort in a way, right? That's what happens. We're struggling. We see the younger generation, reaping the benefits of the rewards of our struggles. And we feel a pang of resentment and envy or disbelief. And so if you peel back the judgment of all of it, what you find underneath is something that's very universal for everyone, which is grief. Because when we say, well, they have it easy, what we're really saying is, I had it hard and I need that to mean something. So every generation wants to believe their pain has purpose, right? Had purpose. That all the sacrifices, the exhaustion, the quiet endurance, all of it, it added up to something very meaningful. That it built character, that it created resilience, that it made us who we are. But what if some of it didn't, right? What if some of it was just pain? Random, unfair, systemic pain that we had to survive because there was no one there to change it. And that's the uncomfortable truth that lies beneath so much of the generational tension that we see. The resentment isn't just about kids these days. It's about their freedom, their choices, their boundaries, and in what it says about ours. So let's start with some headlines, right? What are some of the headlines that we see all the time? Gen Z doesn't want to work. Millennials are entitled. Gen X is bitter and burned out. Boomers are out of touch. The same cycle every 15 years or so. Every generation becomes both the villain and the punchline. But these stereotypes aren't really just projections of disappointment. It's our collective grief about what didn't turn out the way we thought it would. Because when you're young, you live in a world of possibility. You imagine your life unfolding in this straight line, right? Of school and college, career, family, stability, happiness. You believe that if you make good choices, you will always be rewarded. That hard work and morality and effort guarantee success. And then life happens. The job market crashes, the company downsizes, the relationship falls apart, and you realize that the right choices don't always lead to the right outcomes. And you start to see how much of life is shaped by timing, about privilege, and about luck. And that realization can be devastating and difficult to stomach because the vision you held for your life, the one that got you through your 20s and 30s, it starts to crumble. And it's a form of grief. It's not a dramatic grief. It's kind of a quiet grief. It's the kind that looks like irritability and exhaustion and numbness and cynicism, right? It's the kind that shows up when you see someone younger doing things differently and you can't tell if you're angry at them or envious. And so, I talk a lot about pop culture. I'm really fascinated by it. And, pop culture has always told this story for us, right? In the 90s, we had Reality Bites with Winona Ryder and Ethan Hawke, floating through, their post-college malaise. They were smart, capable, but lost. They didn't want to sell out, but they didn't know what else to do. And boomers called them lazy. And then girls came in 2010. Lena Dunham's Millennials trying to find themselves in a world that offered little stability. They were mocked for being self-absorbed, for talking too much about feelings, for not being tough enough. And now we've got shows like Euphoria and The Bear and all of the therapy talk that's all over TikTok. And Gen Z is, trying to find emotional safety in a chaotic, overstimulated world. And what do we say? They're fragile. It's the same script, just different clothes, just different hashtags. Every generation rebrands the struggle to survive in a rapidly changing world. And then the older generation critiques it because it doesn't look like the version of struggle they endured. So here's the pattern, right? Boomers found meaning in sacrifice. Gen Xers, we found meaning in self-reliance. Millennials found meaning in overachievement. And Gen Z is finding meaning in sustainability, in doing good work without losing themselves. And every time the definition of struggle changes, the generation before gets defensive, right? They think to themselves, well, wait a minute, because if the next group gets to live with ease, then it makes your pain feel optional. And that's a painful thought, that maybe you didn't have to suffer as much as you did. And that's at the heart of this generational resentment. The fear that our pain wasn't necessary, or worse, that it didn't lead to the outcome we were promised. I talk to so many different people. I talk to people in their 40s and 50s, and they tell me, I thought my life would look different. And I feel the exact same way. And I'm not miserable. I'm just, and I don't even know if I would say I'm disappointed. I think some people are, but it's just different than what we thought. And so, especially if you're someone who had followed the rules and checked the boxes and did the things that you were supposed to do, you were told that dream, that effort equals reward. And that, that toughness that we attached ourselves to, so much, we have to believe that it is what made us strong. We have to believe there was a positive outcome to it. Because if we don't, what happens, right? We wallow in it. And then, and then we wallow it, and then we numb it, and then we try to numb our way out of it. And then nothing changes. And so this is what you're seeing in the workplace right now. Gen Z sets boundaries, they log off, they take their mental health days, and the older generations bristle. Because when they say, when young people say I'm not available after 6, the Gen X manager or the millennial, hears, I'm doing what you never felt allowed to do. And that stirs something uncomfortable. Anger, for sure, but still back to grief. So grief is the version of ourselves that didn't know how to say no, right? That's what that grief is. Grief for the freedom we didn't think we deserved. Grief for the peace that we never claimed. So instead of processing that grief, we translate it into resentment. We call them lazy. We call them soft. But the truth is that they're living the boundaries that we were too scared to set, or just maybe even didn't even know that we could set. And so that's what I mean when I say every generation wants to believe their pain had purpose. Because if it didn't, if there was another way, then we would have to confront the years that we lost, the energy that we spent, the parts of ourselves we neglected in the name of success. And that's a lot to face. So what do? We avoid it. We defend the very systems that have burned us out because to question them feels like admitting we wasted time. But we didn't waste time. We learned. We learned how painful it is to live out of alignment. We learned what doesn't work for us. And now we have the chance to do it differently. And so this is where Gen Z comes in. They're not rejecting ambition. They're redefining it. They're not saying, I can care deeply. They're saying, I can care deeply about my work, but I won't sacrifice my mental health for it. They're not lazy. They're boundary literate. They're also the first generation to grow up fully immersed in technology and, seeing the world's chaos in real time. So imagine where they're coming from. They've watched recessions, pandemics, political divides, climate disasters, all before the age of 25. So, of course, they're anxious. Of course, they want balance. Of course, they're questioning everything. And that questioning, that willingness to say, this doesn't feel right. That's what progress looks like. Every generation that comes after is supposed to make it a little bit easier. That's what evolution is. It's not supposed to get harder, it's supposed to get healthier. So here's the paradox, right? The faster the world changes, the harder it is for older generations to adapt. We used to have decades before, between major disruptions, and now it feels like it's every year. AI is a perfect example. It's not just a technological shift, it's an existential one. It forces us to ask, what is my value if a machine can do what I can do? And for boomers and Gen Xers, right, this hits hard because these generations were taught that expertise, loyalty, mastery were the currency of success. If you were the best at what you did, you would always be safe. But AI doesn't care about mastery. It learns it in seconds. So the very thing that once made you valuable now feels replaceable. And that's not just fear, that's grief. Grief for a world that once made sense to you, grief for a version of work and identity that you felt comfortable with that is now slipping away. And for millennials, this is complicated for them too, because they've straddled both worlds, right? The analog and the digital, and they're all just really exhausted. I always say that millennials are the most burned out generation. They're the most exhausted ones trying to keep up. So, because again, right, we were told technology is supposed to make our lives easier. Instead, it made it, never ending. It made it so that we can never disconnect, that we're overly informed, that we're emotionally flooded all the time with images that we don't necessarily need to see all the time, but feel like we should. And what happens is that we all become both these creators and the casualties of constant change. So for Gen Z, they've never known anything else than this chaos. They've lived in this chaos since birth. In the economic environment, informational world that we live in, they've lived it every single day. And so that's the thing, these technological changes, that isn't something that they fear, right? It's their baseline, which means that they're not panicking the same way that we are, but they are deeply aware that the old systems just can't hold up. And here's the thing, that discomfort, the discomfort of change is universal, but we express it generationally, right? So older generations mourn what's ending, younger generations question what next. Both are valid, both are necessary. But if we stay stuck blaming each other, we will miss the whole point of all of this, which is that everyone is trying to navigate a loss of certainty, a loss of control, a loss of the world we thought we understood. That's why this moment in time, this moment in our history feels so tense. We're not just debating technology or work ethic. We're in some ways collectively grieving safety, simplicity, grieving predictability. We're grieving the illusion that hard work alone could guarantee success. And we're grieving the idea that the world would stay still long enough for us to master it. All right, so grief doesn't have to harden you. Grief can open you up. It can soften all the edges between generations if we really, really let it, if we allow it to soften us. Because when you stop pretending that you have it all figured out, you can start making space for connection. When you say things like, yeah, this is hard, instead of, I just don't get these kids, you start to see how much we're carrying. Boomers, they're carrying regret for a world that changed faster than they can progress. We're Gen X, we're, carrying the exhaustion from holding everything quietly together all the time. Millennials are carrying disillusionment, the weight of unmet expectations. And Gen Z is carrying the anxiety of being the first generation to grow up knowing the world is on fire, literally and figuratively. Different pains, same emotions. We are all grieving something. So maybe the real rebrand isn't so much about, which generation had it hardest. Maybe it's about finally simply acknowledging the grief underneath it all. the grief of lost dreams, the grief of constant change, the grief of normalizing, of realizing that life is more uncertain, more uncontrollable, and more unfair than anyone was told. And maybe the purpose of our pain isn't to defend it, but to transform it, to use it as wisdom instead of armor. So the next time you hear someone say, well, they have it so easy, just pause. Ask yourself, do they, whatever generation this is, really have it easy? Or am I just mourning the version of life I thought I'd have? And when you feel that pang of envy at someone else's peace, try to see it as an invitation, not as an insult. They're not trying to hurt you. Because what if their freedom is the next step of your evolution? What if the point of every generation isn't to prove who struggled more, but to make it easier for the next one to live with more humanity, more balance, and more peace? That's not weakness, that's progress. So we're all part of this great rebrand, right? The ongoing human project of redefining what it means to live, to work, and to find purpose in a world that refuses to sit still, that refuses to stay stuck, stay in one place. And that's scary, and that's messy, and that feels uncontrollable. But it's also the most honest thing that we can do and admit to ourselves, because change isn't the enemy, it's stagnation. And grief isn't failure, it's the proof that we actually cared. And every generation wants to believe their pain had purpose, and it did. But maybe the purpose was to get us here to this exact moment when we're finally stopped competing for who had it worst and start working together to kind of try to figure out, how do we make it better? So I don't know. I find generation and all this generational stuff so utterly fascinating. But one of the biggest things that I see, and one of the things that keeps a lot of people stuck, is just exactly what I was just talking about, which is this, is that spending too much time and energy focusing on the other generation and what they have and what how they are versus you, how they have it easier, or, and you had it harder. But it's really about looking at that next generation, seeing how this is an evolution, that, yeah, we want to make it easier for people. That's part of the process. And that if we have made it easier for the next generation, then we are doing our jobs. Then we are doing exactly what we need to do. And that whatever we didn't get, or whatever was unfulfilled for us in our own generation, whenever we were born, that's not on the younger generations or the older generations to kind of fix that for you. It's on you to figure out, okay, so how can I reconcile this? I can't change the past. I can't make myself, realize and understand all these things, that I should have realized at 22. So what do? You realize them today. You recognize them today. And so for me, what that really translates into is that, right, I never really thought about, when I started my career, my mental health. And I look back and go, God, why didn't I? That would have been a really smart thing to do. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe things would have been better. Maybe things wouldn't have been so hard. But I can't sit here and be resentful of my clients who are 22, 23 and taking care of their mental health. All I can do is see how taking care of my mental health today, shifting and changing my relationship with work and how much I work and how the work defines me and all of those things, that's what I can do today. That's my evolution, and that's the change that I can make. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in, and thanks for listening to the Gen Mess with Tess. Remember, we're not just fixing the mess, we're learning how to live in it.